The first thing you notice at the Vignettto after midnight isn't the noise, it's the silence underneath it. The club has a way of pretending everything is bright and loud, while the important things stay careful and quiet, like blood behind glass. People come to pretend they are other people. The music covers the hunger. The chandeliers throw faces into pieces. I learned to read the spaces between those pieces years ago. You learn to be invisible by noticing everything no one else does. He arrived like a season. Lorenzo Vulkov moved through the room, and the room reshaped itself around him. Conversations folded. A man with that kind of money has the muscle of a crowd. It parts. It smells different. He wore a suit that looked expensive enough to have been stitched from the same silence he carried. He had a guard to the left, a shadow to the right, and a face that seemed bored of being obeyed. Marco was at the far end of my bar, a young manager with hands that still trembled when he tried to look confident. He likes to show off. Not everyone who can tie a tie thinks they can lie. He took Lorenzo's glass with a small theatrical flourish, a polite reach that hid something smaller inside his palm. An unlabeled bottle, no bigger than a thumbnail. He pinched it between forefinger and thumb like it was an insect he meant to crush, or a secret he hoped would fly. If you stand behind a bar long enough, you learn the shapes of people's hands. You learn the quiet habits that don't get photographed. Marco's fingers shook, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the part of him that wanted to be someone else tonight. He uncorked the tiny bottle, an internalist's whisper of a hiss, and dropped a single, perfectly measured bead into Lorenzo's skull-shaped vodka glass. The bead made a tiny ripple like a guilty heartbeat. Everything else contracted. There are moments that compress time so small you could slice them open and read the names stitched into the seams. I reached for a napkin without thinking. The napkin paper is the same kind we use for bills and secrets. It takes ink and instruction with the same easy absorption. My hand moved. My pen wrote before my brain had finished deciding. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. The letters were small, 5 words. The sentence felt ridiculous and terribly literal. I folded it once and slid it across the lacquer of the bar, the corner of paper catching light like something alive. Lorenzo's glance found it and then found me. He picked up the napkin between 2 fingers, read in a voice that didn't bother to be loud. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. He pinched my wrist with one perfectly deliberate hand. Metal met skin, the weight of someone who has never needed to whisper to be heard. He held the napkin with the other, the ink sinking into his awareness. He didn't smile. He didn't leave. He stood. The room registered the small earthquake. The 2 men nearest him, Kyle and Alexei, moved as if part of a well-oiled machine that knew where to stand. Marco had the look of a man who'd been caught unbuttoning his own life. He swallowed something that might have been a word. Lorenzo's mouth made a line that read like weather. Who wrote this? He asked. His voice was slow and perfectly tuned to make people answer him whether they wanted to or not. I said, I did. There are 3 ways people answer a question under that kind of pressure. They lie, they apologize, or they tell the truth because it is the only small weapon they have left. I picked the last because I am, professionally, someone who notices odds. I knew then that telling the truth would not save me. It would put a price on me, and the price would be curious hands and private rooms. But lying felt like throwing away my own eyes. He looked at my hands, he looked at the napkin, then he looked at the tiny bottle rolling under the bar, caught between the footrest and the polished oak. Kyle bent, picked it up. He smelled it like a priest inspecting holy water. There was citrus. There was something like varnish. He did not put it to his mouth. "How did you know?" Lorenzo asked. Not about the poison, but about the writing. No one asks a bartender that. But he wasn't addressing the job. He was reading the margins of my life. Because I had been watching Marco all night. Because he can't hide a tremor from someone who has spent years measuring tremors. Because the bottle and the way he moved his thumb over the cap told a story older than his courage. "He was nervous," I said. He came back from the kitchen with a fake smile. He wiped down the counter twice in a row. He spilled too much salt on a tray for no reason. "You're bold," Lorenzo said. It could have been a compliment. It wasn't. He didn't arrest Marco. He didn't call anyone. He did something worse and more precise. He drew me into his orbit. He put his thumb on my wrist like a compass and led me out of the room and into the night's air. They took me away in a Rolls-Royce with windows dark as a secret. I sat between two men whose faces were already carved into my memory. Cale, the watchman, whose eyes did the math on exits. Franco, the lieutenant who spoke with a man's throat that had swallowed too many threats. Lorenzo sat opposite me, the night bending light across the angles of him. He smelled like old money and bergamot. He smelled like silence. No one shouted. No hands were raised beyond the necessary. There is a kind of violence that is neat and tidy. They prefer it because it keeps footprints short and stories shorter. The car moved like a metronome. The city unrolled behind us. Neon, then older blocks, then the glass of a building that threw our faces back at us like questions. At the penthouse, they did what modern kidnappers do best. They made it elegant. The place looked like a gallery put itself on guard duty. There was chrome and a view that showed the city's pulse as if it were a distant animal. They stripped my phone of its numbers and gave me new ones that belonged to dead men. They took my purse and replaced it with a wallet that had a name I had never seen before. Papers appeared, a passport with my face and a name they told me to learn. I learned it like a prayer I didn't believe. Miss Petrova arrived with the day. She handled logistics with the cruelty of someone who'd been promised a thing and given power instead. She brought me coffee in a cup that had never known the taste of the street, and arranged my hair in a way that said I belonged in the frames these men liked to live inside. "You are evidence," Lorenzo said, later in a library that smelled of leather and old ink. He moved his hand along a row of books like a man deciding where to lay a chess piece. "And you're a tool. There is a difference between being evidence and being a tool. Evidence sits quietly in a box and waits to be opened by someone with the patience of an archivist. A tool gets used and replaced. One has dignity given by distance. The other has purpose assigned with intent. I am both," I said. It was the truth in the shape they wanted. He studied me as if he were trying to map a continent with his eyes. Or one of them. He watched the night's footage in a small black box of a screen. His men set up a room where the only light came from grainy playback, a theater of things that could not be unsaid. We watched Marco move, a squirrel at a feast, and then the invisible hand that took him away. The footage was silver and of poor quality, but some things don't require clarity. They require attention. "See the man who met him at the alley?" Franco said, pointing at a figure with hands shoved in pockets. "Notice the ring." A hand showed a close-up, a shaky frame where sunlight glanced off a small circlet. It wasn't a diamond or a crest, but a hawk, carved in haste maybe, or in a way that meant everything to someone who sells danger for a living. It sat on a pinky the way secret clubs used to wear badges. Silas Hawke, Lorenzo said. He didn't ask. The name flowed like accusation. He said it as if he had tasted it before. Broker. When you make your living listening to people, you also listen for names. Silas Hawke was a rumor given shape, an intermediary the way vultures are intermediaries between death and payroll. He moved deals like a man who never wanted blood on his hands, but relished the scent in the air. He brokered poisoners and cleanups, and he kept his hands off the real dirt. Marco was dead by the time the footage looped back to show him again. Someone had made him disappear in a way that smelled of professional efficiency, staged, precise, absent of mistake. Someone wiped the fingerprints off the edges of the crime so it read like something accomplished by gloves. Lorenzo watched it without blinking, not because he enjoyed it, but because there are things a man must memorize if he wants to hold a city together. "Who sent him?" he asked me. I could have said I didn't know. Instead, I noticed the way the man on the screen said a single word into a phone before he turned away. Even people who think they're careful have a way of leaving syntax behind like breadcrumbs. I told Lorenzo about the way the man had used the word perch in his speech, not in a normal sentence, but as if rehearsing a cover. Brokers like to use harmless words as codes. It's their perfume. He listened. He nodded. Then he turned to a ledger they had produced as if from nowhere. Anthony Riachi's handwriting sprawled across a page, like someone trying to make arithmetic feel like an alibi. There were sums and dates and a description line that read like a private joke. Operational allowances, rust-colored hush to account 77. "Who uses rust-colored?" I asked. He gave me a look, the way a man gives a verdict. "A politician," he said. "Rustinowski likes his metaphors. He pays in euphemisms." We are all, in the end, known by the way we phrase things. The ledger smelled of ink and old cigarette smoke. The way the numbers lined up was not the work of a novice. This was accounting with a conscience that had been taught to sleep. Anthony had been handling the money. The money was going somewhere. The someone was the kind of someone who puts politicians in his pocket and keeps them polite. They called Anthony in. When Anthony came, he had the look of a man who does not expect to be surprised like a child left out in the rain. His hands were steady, trying to be steady. He confirmed small things before he tried to make himself small. He said that payments had been made to a shell company with a name like a weather pattern. He said Marco had been recently assigned to housekeeping tasks. He said the word cleaned, as if it were a necessary verb and nothing more. He tried to tell the story like it was a ledger, and not a series of men who had stopped breathing because someone had decided to clean their slate. Lorenzo laid down pages and images and named what he wanted to name. Hawke coordinates a hit. Anthony moves money. Marco is the set piece. Someone cleans Marco. Someone else feeds a story to the left flank, Sergio. Sergio was a slow smile operative in IV tones. Someone who likes to replace people and keeps a spare set of teeth for the job. He had been on the margins of Lorenzo's maps for a long time. If you are close enough to him, you know he keeps a forked tongue in his pocket for big meals. The library became a theater of conjectures. We arranged motives like chess pieces and then knocked them over to see how their edges abraded. My role was to watch for the things no one else saw. Dust patterns on the terrace where the killer had walked. The way the scuff ended at the banister in a direction that said someone had been lifted. The way a cocktail napkin's wind wrinkle told you which way the door had been opened. The smallest things added up. You see, Lorenzo said quietly, holding the napkin between two fingers, you keep your eyes open. Because I make my living there, I said. People leave pieces of themselves behind. It's a hobby of mine. He pinned me with a look that was both curiosity and calculation. You could be useful. Useful. It's a word that promises trade. Evidence traded for freedom, observation traded for safety. There is always a market in any city for what is valuable. My eyes had been currency in a life where everyone else had spent theirs on more obvious things. The first week was ritualized. I was left enough room to breathe and not enough to leave. There were no locks they couldn't open and no guards who weren't polite. They fed me food that was bland because hospitality and coercion taste the same once you mix them. I learned the layout the way sailors learn a ship, the exits, the cameras, the clocks. Each clock ticked with intent. The bracelet came in on a tray one night after I'd been relegated to the library for debriefing, a polite word for an hour of observation cloaked as conversation. It arrived in a box black as a sin. Inside, nestled like something that had been bought and named in a hurry, was a cuff with a single black diamond set in a bar of gunmetal. It was not the sort of thing you give to someone you own. It was the sort of thing you give someone you want to remind you own them. Lorenzo placed it on my wrist with the sort of reverence a man reserves for weapons he might later need to keep polished. Ownership, he said, half a joke and half a claim. Call it a guarantee. I felt the weight of it like a pulse. It snagged against my skin with the temperature of a hand that had been held too long. It glittered under the library's reading lamp, a small, relentless star that refused to be ignored. That night, it lay on my skin like an accusation I had not yet learned to answer. There were other moments that unspooled in quieter threads. He taught me how to read the city like a ledger, and I taught him how to read people like paper. He would ask me about small things, the way a woman orders a martini when she's lying, or the way a man who is braver than smart drinks scotch neat because he prefers his courage straight. He would listen. He didn't pretend to be human. He pretended to be a man who had hired himself out to be something more efficient than that. There was a hunger about him that felt like the hunger of someone who has been denied the soft edges of life. A week after the napkin, the first intimacy happened. It was not a theft of tenderness. It was an arrangement between two people who recognized the leverage of closeness. We were in the dining room that breathed into the night over the city's bones. A record played somewhere, a low piano that wanted to keep us honest. He sat close enough that the heat of his shoulder made the air between us thinner. He kissed me like a man learning to remember a map from the folds of my face. There is a difference between an act taken to seduce and an act taken to claim. He did not ask for permission because he had never needed to. I did not resist because I had learned that sometimes you soften the edges of what is coming if you place yourself into the center of it. It is a pragmatic form of survival, an attempt to steer the shape of violence into something you can read. Afterwards, I felt more like a ledger than a person. I catalogued feelings like receipts, gratitude, shame, a small, fierce river of dignity that refused to drown. He watched me with that same careful expression he kept for books and watches and weak men. He put the bracelet back on my wrist as if affixing a label. "It will make things simpler," he said, "and it will remind whoever looks that you are in my possession." It didn't make things simpler. It made things real. It made me carry the mark. It made me into a signal. When you are someone's possession, the world notices in different ways. There are invitations and exclusions. There are explanations you do not get to make. We planned to catch Silas Hawke. That was the first time they let me out with a purpose that wasn't simple observation. A broker leaves fingerprints in language and ritual, and brokers like public places because they are good at being invisible in crowds. The Orpheum Theatre, a decaying cathedral of velvet and wood, was a place where Silas's kind liked to meet, dim, official, with shadows that made you feel like you were being watched by angels who knew how to keep secrets. They set up a command van in an alley across the street. Screens glowed with grainy feeds. Men who could cut someone in half with a look sat in folding chairs and drank coffee like it contained courage. I was there because I could read a crowd from behind a bar, because I could point to a man and tell you whether he was lying or whether he had practiced being honest until he remembered how it felt. Our plan was patient and simple. Bait, wait, expose. Lorenzo would send a message through his channels suggesting a decoy drop at the Orpheum. Brokers cannot resist certain offers. They think of them as a carnival of opportunity. We would watch. We would wait for Hawke to show his hand. We had no illusions. The world is not a neat place where plans are followed like recipes. It is a messy, human thing full of improvisation and betrayal. We put ourselves where we could see the betrayal from both sides. The day of the operation, the rain looked like bad news. It came down in sheets and made the city's lights smear like bleeding ink. The theater smelled like curtains and dust. From the balcony, the crowd looked like a pool of waiting faces. I watched, counting the ways someone could move and be invisible. He did arrive, a man with a hawk ring on his finger, small and unnoticed until you pointed at it like a bone in a river. He moved with the economy of someone who has never been surprised. He sat far enough away that his presence was an underline rather than a paragraph. We watched him in grain. We watched him in hope. Then the decoy moved wrong. Someone made a change at the wrong second. An accomplice in our net wasn't an accomplice at all, but a local cop. 2 ways out of his jurisdiction. An ambiguity no one had planned for. The operation collapsed with the elegance of something snapped. A decoy chased a shadow into the street, and what we thought would be a parade turned into a sprint. They had him move. He ran through rain, a silhouette that could have been any man. Our van went after the wrong shadow. We chased movement and lost the hand we were supposed to read. The grainy cameras tried to pick up a telephone number of feet and failed. We returned to the penthouse with the taste of failure on our tongues. The operation had been clever at conception and cowed at execution. It left us with more questions and fewer bones to hold. We were all quieter that night, as if the silence at the Vignettto had followed us home and tucked itself under our pillows. Lorenzo didn't raise his voice. He sat and unbuttoned his cuff, the way a man tries to unbend something that has been bent too often. "He slipped," he said. "A man like him doesn't use the word lightly. It was a verdict and an invitation. Someone tipped them. Someone tipped them. The city is full of ears, and ears have pockets." We set the ledger again in the light. Anthony's numbers had a new entry with the same euphemistic aesthetic. For facilitation, rust tint. It pointed to someone who liked to buy silence with metaphors. We cross-referenced names and places and came back to someone who liked small favors made costly, Rustinowski, a politician, a man with a newspaper face and a tie that matched the measured politeness of his lies. It is never comfortable to watch the line between criminal and respectable blur. It is a chemical reaction the body rejects. Money moves the way water does. It finds the soft places in structures and pools there. The evidence suggested a meeting where hands had been rubbed and someone had left dirt on a cufflink. The more we peeled the onion, the more it burned. People who thought themselves above the gutter had habits. They used code words. They paid in euphemisms. They thought themselves clever for using metaphors like currency. They were as shallow as anyone else. They just had better lighting. The napkin was still folded in my pocket the night after the failed chase. I fished it out and smoothed it with a thumb that felt like it had been carved in the shape of a nervous animal. "Don't drink it. Smile and leave now." The words looked childish on the paper, like a child's instruction manual for grown-up danger. A small, precise sentence that had changed my life and made me consider again the trade-offs painted across my palms. Lorenzo watched me fold the napkin back and tuck it away. He must have seen me do that 100 times without noticing. "You keep that," he said. "It suits you." "It kept me from watching a man die," I said. It wasn't a point to argue about. It was a statement. The napkin had been a small, rude provocation, enough to make something change. He moved me into a different room after that, the office with windows that faced nothing but the city's shoulders. He sat behind a desk as if it were a pulpit and arranged files like a man confessing. "We will have to choose you," he said, "if we are going to play this right. Choose me." The word had a taste like the metal of cheap coins. Do you choose survival, or do you choose the moral cleanliness that might get you dead quicker? In a city like ours, options are a trick. You pick the least dangerous path and tell yourself it is freedom. I looked at him. I thought of the bracelet and the ways it glinted. I thought of the napkin, its small imperative. I thought of Marco and the way his fingers had betrayed him. I thought of Anthony and his metaphors. I thought of the man with the hawk ring and the way his hand had flicked the world like a coin. "You'll use me," I said. "Yes." "And if I refuse?" He smiled like a man who keeps a spare knife for unexpected meals. "Refusal is an option, Ara. So is regret. They both taste the same on different nights." Between those 2 nights there was another kind of quiet. A man like me learns that the difference between being a witness and being a participant is the angle from which you look at the truth. If you stand up close, you live with the heat. If you stand far away, you may never feel the burn, but you will always smell smoke. They wanted me to go to the gala. Not tonight, not yet. It was a future like a horizon you could not see without stepping closer. For now, the Orpheum had failed to give us hawk's feathers. We shifted plans. We sat in rooms and drew maps. We arranged who would move and who would wait. The napkin sat in my pocket like an early warning system, and the bracelet sent little cold signals down my arm that made me know where I lived now. The choice they offered hung between us. I could remain a weapon masquerading as a witness, watching and being watched, or I could try to find a way to turn my observation into leverage. There is a slight difference between being someone's tool and bargaining to be his partner in a transaction. It's the difference between losing and negotiating a new kind of survival. I rubbed the bracelet until it warmed under my skin and thought about the rules I had been taught as a child. Don't carry more truth than you can afford. Don't be seen when you can help it. And never let a man choose your name for you. They gave me papers with a foreign name on them and told me to practice it with the same mechanical calm I had once used to pour drinks. I practiced in the mirror. Ararossi. The name sounded like a small promise I could rehearse. We would go after Hawk again. This time I would be a lure, but not the bait no one watches. I would be the person who saw the signs before they happened and fed them into the ledger Lorenzo kept like a Bible. The Orpheum would get another try. The city had been patient until now. It would wear down patience into action. I slept poorly that night. A kind of hunger lives in bones that have been catalogued by other people's hands. I dreamed of being behind a bar with the city pressing shoulders to the other side, and my hands stained with things I did not want to own. I woke to the bracelet's weight and the napkin's ink. The world was mourning and also a calculus. When I left to meet the men in the van that would take me to the theater, when they handed me a coat that didn't fit right and a smile that was practiced to be indistinguishable from warmth, I folded the napkin again and slipped it in a pocket. I touched the bracelet before I left and felt the cold stabilizing me like a compass. The rolls, the lighting, the men in their chairs, the city's animal breath. The napkin's imperative was a small order I had given the world, and the world had answered with an entirely different conversation. I crossed the street and stepped under the Orpheum's awning. The rain had scrubbed the glass as if trying to make us honest. I understood then that the night liked to pretend it kept secrets, but it couldn't. Not for long. You only get one true first impression in operations like these, and I had wasted mine once. I would not waste it again. Inside, a man shifted in a manner that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. I catalogued the small things like automatic muscles, the way his right shoe pinched his heel, the minute shake in his left hand, the hawk ring catching a flash of light like an eye. He turned. He smiled like someone who thought he had not been seen. He had been seen. I had been watching him for longer than he knew. The world rearranged itself into the look of a decision you could still influence. Outside, people waited to be entertained. Inside, the theater tried to keep a heartbeat steady. In my pocket, the napkin was a weather forecast of the night to come. My wrist felt heavy with the bracelet's cold. I was going in as a witness who knew too much, and as something else that was harder to name. The choice I had made earlier, the one that kept me breathing, had the softness of a coin pressed into a palm, and the hardness of a life now balanced on an edge. We moved into position. The van hummed. Men checked watches. I smoothed my skirt and thought, because that is what I always did, of the tiny things that leave tracks. A shoe scuffed a step and tells you where a man has been. A word chooses a crowd and reveals a tribe. I noticed his ring again and the way his jaw tightened when he didn't have to. He was a broker. He was Hawk. He was a man who moved money and left people to die politely. Someone inside the theater breathed, and the sound traveled like an omen. The first act was about to open. The curtain would soon fall on the little deceit we had chosen to stage. I felt the napkin against my thigh and the bracelet's metal against my skin, and knew both would tell a story long after my voice sputtered into a whisper. I waited. The city, patient and cruel, watched back. He turned his head the way a hawk does when someone whispers its name. The theater's light washed his jaw in pale certainty. For a second his face was nothing but the shape of a decision. Then he rose, deliberately slow, like a man who wanted to make an exit that could be read as theater instead of flight. "Now," whispered Franco in my ear, and the van screens flared with movement. Everything that follows an order in a plan is either clean or messy. Tonight it wanted to be messy. Men stood from folding chairs and folded into quiet rhythms. A woman in a mink coat stood to the side and clapped the wrong song. A man with a cane moved with the momentum of an excuse. The rain had given the city a wash that made everyone look guiltier and everyone look better. My heart beat an instant ahead of my hands. I watched him through the grain like someone who remembers faces as recipes. The ring caught lamplight and winked like a secret handshake. He moved down the aisle with a small man padding his steps beside him, and the padding man touched the underside of his jacket the way people touch treasured scars. That small motion told me what a ledger could not. The courier carried the day's receipt. 3 minutes, whispered Cale. The moment we had rehearsed 1,000 times, on paper, over coffee, under the impartial eye of the black screen, contracted into a window you could hide a life in. The plan was simple. Nudge the man into motion with a staged commotion. Follow his courier. Isolate him under the glare of lights where the cameras could not lie, and then retrieve what he carried. We would expose him, then pull the thread until Hawk's sleeve unraveled. The commotion started like a chorus of small accidents. A dropped program, a crying child who was not crying but practicing, a pair of lovers who argued loudly about nothing. I stayed in my seat and let the noise press, counting breaths instead of seeing faces. He rose and moved faster now, as if the theater's disorder were a good excuse. The courier was a gray silhouette with hands in pockets and shoulders rounded like someone who keeps secrets in his ribcage. He left through a side door. We flowed after him. The alley he chose was the city's bruise, squeezed between a shuttered bakery and a charity board office with its posters peeling. Rain sluiced down wires and pooled in the shapes of faces the street had once promised to forget. He walked fast and precise, not a man fleeing, but a man late for an appointment he did not want to miss. We followed in 2 cars. I rode in the second with Cale and Franco, the city blurred in low-lit lumps. Franco made a face like a boy who can't stand the piano practice but is safe because an adult is there to play it. "Keep your eyes on the left flank," he said. "If he goes toward the market, they're tipped." I kept my breath small and tasted metal. You learn to keep your mouth from speaking in the way it used to when you poured drinks for men who would drink themselves into confessions. My job was to read people like menus and tell my employer what the specials were. Tonight the menu was a list of men who had forgotten they were being read. They split. He went one way. The courier, shorter, with a hat that had seen better winters, went another. We trailed both in a neat, crooked line. Then, as if the city loved theatrical cruelty, the courier turned into a doorway that led to a courtyard, luminous with sodium light. Another man stepped out of the shadows and slid a small envelope into his hand. It was the kind of exchange that writes itself neat as a confession in a ledger. "Stop," Cale said. They boxed them in like 2 men who thought their lives were still private. Franco moved first. The courier's hand closed over the envelope like it was iron. He made no dramatic move. Men who move often in the service of danger learn small economies. Keep your face calm, your hands doing what they are always doing, and your voice a small thing no one expects to hear. Franco took the courier by the shoulder. "What do you have?" The courier laughed, a thin sound without amusement. "You think you can just take what isn't yours?" he asked, and in his voice there was a practiced insolence. People who traffic in small cruelties get good at feigning bravery. Franco's hand tightened. "We're not here for you to grandstand." The courier's eyes flicked at me, one quick, practiced appraisal, and in the motion I saw a detail like a breadcrumb. The way he said "we," with a particular swallowing of the vowel that made it sound like "vur," regional, not local, the sort of accent a broker would pick for distance. I pinched that syllable in my head like a note and held it. "Open it," Cale said, and the courier's hand jammed. Then a noise from down the alley, a screech of tires, a shout, and the courier shoved the envelope into Franco's grip and turned like a man who had suddenly remembered an appointment. He bolted. We ran. The alley split into a feeder street, and then the market opened like a mouth. Vendors called over steam, and fish scales flashed in plastic. The courier melted between stalls the way heat melts fog. Not gone, just camouflaged. We chased. The city insisted on being alive, so it hid and it lied. Then there was a scream, a simple human noise, and the grainy truth unspooled. The courier dove between two carts and collided with a woman balancing boxes. She cursed in a language I had not expected, and then, as if the world were an instrument, the courier slammed into a vendor's table and the envelope burst open in a rain of folded paper. Receipts, a small ledger, a photograph of someone I recognized from our feeds. Silas Hawke. His hand rested on a table in a room smelling of mildew and lemon oil. I caught a scrap. On it, a scrawled list of names and numbers and that same code Andrea had pointed out earlier in the ledger. Rust tint, facilitation. There was also a phone number, old format, almost ceremonial in its persistence. Franco snapped his fingers and Cale dove for it, but the courier had already melted into the crowd like a stain. We held the scrap like a trophy. It was a sliver of proof that smelled like hope and fear. Back in the van, under the indifferent light of a dashboard, Lorenzo watched the footage and held the scrap as if it were fragile. He didn't shout. He doesn't shout. He collects storms and lets them out in small, dangerous increments. "We have a number," he said. "We have a trace. That means we have a meeting." "So Hawke will come?" I asked. He looked at me then, and for a moment the room was all the details. The bracelet's dark glint, the napkin folded in my pocket, the ledger's black ink like a map. "He will send someone," he said. "Brokers don't go to the front lines. They send cloaks. We traced the number to a burner service, a nest of accounts and reroutings, and then to a name I had seen in our files but not yet read as anything but background, a contractor who supplied event staging, the sort of company that gilds reception halls and launders attention. They had invoices that matched the payments in Anthony's ledger. The ink lined up like a contingent of ants. We narrowed their activity to the museum gala, a fundraiser where polish and influence braided into a ribbon you could not cut without being noticed. Rustanowski was on the guest list. His face was a stamp used in polite forgery. The more I read, the less surprised I was to find him in the margins. Politicians are birds that thrive on crumbs. "That's where they'll exchange the next piece," Franco said. "The charity gala will be the curtain." "Why the gala?" Cale asked. "Too many cameras." "Because it's a place where money feels respectable," Lorenzo said. "They will hand off payroll under the noise of applause. People won't look twice at what their hands are doing while their faces smile." It was an elegant cruelty. The gala would be full of people who believed in the illusion of respectability. They would wear their moral alibis like corsages. We spent the next week building a map. In the library, Lorenzo, Franco, Carl, Miss Petrova, and I sat around a table with the city's small failings spread like paper. We watched video loops and annotated them with coffee stains. We made margins where there were no margins. My job, at first glance, was to be a translator of small people into useful clues, who flinched when their name surfaced on film, who avoided eye contact when the ledger leafed, who smoothed their cuff as if they had a hidden purchase to erase. Anthony gave us access to ledgers because he thought we could frighten him into cooperation with more kindness than murder. He had the look of a man who had been used to being a cog and suddenly discovered he was a lever. He offered account numbers and pale excuses. He didn't act like a man who expected to walk away. He acted like a man making a plea. "This is an economy of euphemisms," he said, fidgeting with a pen. "You get paid and you call it maintenance. You move funds and you call it charitable giving. People like words because they feel cleaner than actions." "Who uses rust tint specifically?" Lorenzo asked, and Anthony's face unmade. "The alderman. Rustinowski likes the phrase." The name dried in the air like spilled paint. "He uses it to mean one-off facilitation. He never puts his face to the ledger. He asks me to move funds through a shell tied to a staging company. He likes to be distanced." Lorenzo folded his hands. "How do the payments move?" he asked calmly. Anthony swallowed. He gave us a sequence that read like industrial choreography. Small deposits into a staging company's account, offloaded to intermediaries that paid runners who couriered cash in envelopes labeled with innocuous descriptors. Catering, floral, venue assistance. The money moved in the spaces between respectability and cash, and it found the soft places where a politician could pretend ignorance. "Who authorized the staging invoices?" I asked, because I had begun noticing the small things in Anthony's speech the way a fisherman notices the ripple before the wave. I had become used to finding the secret syntax of men who thought themselves invisible. Anthony hesitated. "Sergio signs a lot of them," he said finally. "He schedules bookings. He's got an account in his name that meshes with their dates. He says he's handling operations." Sergio. The name landed with a dull thud. He had been a shadow on the edges of Lorenzo's world for years, quiet, efficient, ambitious in the way a machine is ambitious, the kind of man who smells the lubricant of power and decides to grease his hands with it. The evidence leaned like a witness pointing at a man who liked to accumulate favors for a coming day. We cross-checked Sergio's calendar with the staging invoices. He had been at the right places at the right times too often to be a coincidence. An entry in his private ledger was marked with the same euphemism Anthony used in his big accounting phrase. Someone had been lazy in their metaphors, or too clever. Lorenzo sat back and let the room's small echo of breathing linger. "Sergio wants what he can't create," he said. "He'll buy it." That night, I lay awake in a bed that felt like borrowed thrift and rolled the napkin between my fingers. "Don't drink it. Smile and leave now." The instruction insisted on its clarity. I had been the woman who had given that command and watched the man read it and own me. Ownership was a concept Lorenzo understood as both threat and insurance. Sergio's betrayal felt like an internal ulcer, something that had been growing in plain sight. Deciding who to trust is an art form most people never practice. I was learning. The more I observed, the more I realized the city's power was not in the big hands, but in the small, repeated ones. A courier's accent, a vendor's receipt, a politician's preferred metaphor. My life had been assembled from noticing those things long enough that I could hold them like dice and throw them with intent. We set a trap, a false staging request for a private political dinner meant to require in-person coordination. We created, on paper and on systems, a need for Sergio to sign and to send a courier. Lorenzo planted the temptation like a coin in a pair of palms. It takes something irresistible to make an ambitious man step from the shade into open weather. We built it and waited. Sergio took the bait with the subtle satisfaction of a man discovering he had been offered a crown without having to ask for it. He moved as if the city belonged to him by right. Watching him on the grainy screen that night, I saw him do the small things that never make a man confess. He cleared his throat when he lied. He touched his ring as if to assure himself it was still there. He said, "I'll handle it," the way men who plan coups promise desserts. Lorenzo arranged the follow-through with an economy that felt like a scalpel. We sent an intermediary to the neutral ground for paperwork and a courier who insisted on being anonymous. The courier was intercepted and, under pressure, gave up a list of names tied to staging invoices. One of them was the staging company we had flagged. One of them listed Rustinowski's office as a client. Another line connected to a P.O. box leased under a shell company whose signatory name matched a number from Anthony's ledger. You don't get a network from a single wire. You get it when a whole loomed pattern of payments and favors and metaphors points in the same direction. The more pieces that fit, the less uncertain things feel. The city's map, once grimy with denial, began to look like a blueprint. We confronted Sergio in a room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. He was like a man who has learned to perform competence for the sake of survival. The edges of him were all right angles. He smiled like a man who expects his smile to be an alibi. "You've been busy," Lorenzo said. Sergio's smile tightened. "You can't prove anything," he said. "You can make noise, but you can't stop a rumor." "Rumors end when names are attached to them," Franco said. "You signed invoices. You scheduled dates. You left traces." Sergio's face made a slow concession, like a tide inching out. "I had to protect myself," he said. "The city's a jungle. You either hedge your bets or you get eaten. I hedged." "What did you get for hedging?" I asked, because I had been the person watching the ledger like an animal that knows how to starve. "Enough to make a difference," he said. He didn't name the difference. He didn't have to. People like him leave blank spaces that are meant to be filled by greed. Lorenzo watched his hands. "You were trying to replace me," he said simply. Sergio's laugh was small. "I was trying to make sure there wasn't a single point of failure," he said. "You think you're indispensable. Others think otherwise." "Who is the alderman?" Cale demanded. "Who signed off?" Sergio's eyes darted. For a man who had kept his teeth for a long time, he found this moment like a loose page in an old book. "Rustinowski," he said finally. He wanted plausible deniability. He wanted the city's party to look clean. I handled the details. Hawk handled the edges. That name fell like thawed ice. Rustinowski had the face of someone who writes letters to children in public and takes small meals in private. If he was in the net was getting heavy with important things. We did not hand Sergio to the state. We did not have a state to hand him to. We had Lorenzo's methods, leverage, adjustments of the truth, the slow pressure that makes men confess without the theater of violence. We made him talk long enough to make his mouth a minefield. He led us to conversations recorded with a throwaway phone and to courier receipts that matched dates on Anthony's ledger. He admitted, like a man acquiescing to a gust of inevitability, that there had been meetings with Rustinowski's aide in the past 6 months. Payments in envelopes. Timing makes things easier, he said. He used the same euphemisms as everyone else, and in that similarity there was a terrible kinship. "Why Hawk?" I asked, and my voice felt flat in the small room. "Why broker poison at a public bar? Who benefits from the message?" Sergio blinked. "Because it shakes you," he said. "Because it reminds people who runs the sandbox. Marco was a message to you. They wanted to show they could reach in." "Who they?" I pressed. Sergio didn't answer. At that question his lips went thin and his eyes found a spot on the wall as if prayer might be there. The space after "they" seemed to me like a throat that had swallowed a stone. I knew then the conspiracy was bigger than a rivalry. It wasn't just the hunger of a lieutenant. It was orchestration. We started to assemble a case that looked like a letter written in small, stubborn handwriting. The evidence was circumstantial and merciless. Invoices, dates, courier receipts, ring photographs, and the ledger's metaphors. It read like a secret language once you had the key. Rustinowski's name appeared like a stain in a white shirt. We had to consider what to do with that stain. Lorenzo's solution was both brutal and politely surgical. He planned to expose the network where it wouldn't be easy to deny involvement and where the camera-laden crowd would make excuses harder to hold on to. The gala, where the politician would stand under chandeliers and the city's charity asked for applause, would be the perfect place. He wanted a public unmasking that would leak into the press and fracture alliances. It was an ingestion strategy, poison them with their own publicity. "You will go with me," he told me one night in the library, while the rain tattooed the glass in an argument only the city understood. "You'll be my translator and my face." "I don't speak that language," I said. He smiled a small, dangerous smile. "You speak their language. You read them. You'll be what they don't expect, not a bribe nor a boast, but a woman who will translate the silences." "Translate to whom?" I asked. I needed to know the audience. Was I translating for him, for myself, for the city? "For the room," he said, "and for you." He wanted me there because I had eyes he trusted more than most. He wanted me there because I had a napkin in my pocket and because it had the right kind of provocation sewn into its fibers. He wanted me there because I could smile and leave, except now leaving wasn't an option. It never had been. The plan to go public required choreography. I needed cover, an identity in the right social class, and a story that explained my presence. Miss Petrova arranged the paper as if she were naming saints for a new calendar. Invitations forged, introductions written by people who owed favors, a plausible French quirk to my backstory, and a translator's card printed in gold. At night, when the bracelet was heavy and the city quiet, we rehearsed how I would speak, how to let a word linger, how to let a silence do the naming work. He practiced introductions as if he were tuning a violin, and I practiced the pauses as if they were the strings I could pluck. Between rehearsal and rehearsal there were small private collapses. Intimacy, when wrapped in the context of possession, is a different language entirely. The first time had been like a contract signed in the dark. The second was more complicated. It was less about passion and more about reconnaissance, a mapping of what closeness could feel like and where the boundaries were brittle. It was an exchange in which both of us traded information we wanted to keep to ourselves. He kissed me in the office like a man trying to memorize a landscape. He said things about Rilke, about poetry, as if literature might redeem the methods he used. He read sonnets to me in the morning like gentle punishments. He would place his hand on my wrist and follow the line of the bracelet with his thumb as if counting the beat of a clock. I could not call it affection in any honest way. It was an intimacy framed by decisions, an occasional softness given the shape of danger. The cost of such closeness is the way it rearranges loyalty and hunger. I caught myself stealing moments of his attention like contraband. I started to keep notes not just for our plan, but for my own ledger. What he told me under lamplight, the way his jaw unclenched when he spoke of his father, the hesitations he allowed only in private. I collected those as if they belonged to me, because knowledge is currency and a woman who is watched learns to hoard it. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. The napkin felt too small for the purpose it had become. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. The sentence had once been a slap of instruction. Now it was a compass that had been handed back to me with new markings. I thought about Marco's hands as they trembled. I thought about Anthony's ledger, the way it tried to make arithmetic into forgiveness. I thought about Sergio's cool eyes. I thought about the politicians' immaculately pressed shirts. I thought about the risk of stepping into light. "You look tired," he said when he found me in the sitting room. The bracelet, its small leaden sun on my arm. He poured tea like a man who believes in ceremonies that are small and private. "I'm tired of pretending," I said. "Of being something I'm not." "You're not pretending," he corrected softly. "You're performing so you can survive." "Is performance the same as living?" I asked. He didn't answer with a philosophy. He answered with a practical thing. It buys time. There are comforts in practical things. Time is a currency most people do not buy until they have to. I folded the napkin and tucked it into my palm. The letters had begun to level into a mantra. At the gala, we wore polite clothing and polite faces. The museum's atrium smelled of lemon polish and old money. Chandeliers threw light across the crowd like a verdict. Rustinowski's face was ready for cameras, the kind of public smile you train like a dog to fetch when you throw it a scandal. He moved through the room with the gloved efficiency of a man who has practiced his alibis. I stood by Lorenzo as he worked the room with a guide in hand. My translator's card was a small thing I pressed into people's palms like a business card for the underworld. I listened for the cadence of euphemisms and watched hands for envelope shapes. The museum hummed with polite conversation, donors discussing their latest philanthropy, an actress described by three men who had designed a life to be admired. It was the sort of place that hides greed under crystal. He introduced me to a cluster of people who smelled like trust and laundry soap. I translated little things, a phrase into another language, a joke into a smile. My voice felt small in such a room, but small voices can be strategic if they are in the right place. I let my presence be like gauze over a wound, thin enough to be unnoticed, present enough to keep the bleeding visible. Rustinowski arrived in a line of ceremony and media. He moved like a man made of the city's best press. He handled applause the way a man handles a spoon, gently but with practiced efficiency. The crowd's attention is a thing that can be bought and sold in small increments. Tonight it was currency in a ledger we wanted to publish. We had set 2 teams, one to record, one to interrupt. Our plan did not rely on brute force. It relied on making the city see what it usually chose to ignore. Someone had to collect the physical evidence, and someone had to get it in front of cameras where the public truth could be forced to stare. The staging company had a discreet desk manned by a young woman who smiled like a person who had never had to lock a door. I slid into the conversation as if I were there by chance and asked a question about the floral arrangements. Whose job is to ask about flowers? But flowers hide receipts. She started talking briskly about vendors and dates. My ears pricked like a dog trained to the rhythm of useful things. She let slip, by way of casualness, that a certain assistance had been scheduled to arrive in envelopes the week prior. She used the term rust tint, with a smile that implied it was a fashion choice. Her tongue was a key in a lock. I caught it and pinned it under the glass of my voice. Rust tint, I echoed innocently. The woman laughed and repeated the phrase as if she were naming a color palette. The way people said a thing is often a confession of who they serve. She thought she was talking to a woman who liked decor. She was talking to the woman who had translated ledgers into meaning. The cameras, ours thin and hidden, recorded the exchange. The man who walked by with a phone at his ear paused to listen like a dog focusing on a high whistle. He took the woman's card with a polite nod. We had the moment. Then the night hiccuped. One of the rooms where the staging crew prepared the envelopes was waylaid by a man who said he was a cleaner. The cleaner's hands were long and precise, and he had a little scar on his knuckle shaped like a comma. He carried a bag that had more weight than the job required. He went behind a curtain and came out with the envelope the courier had once carried. He moved with the economy of someone who has rehearsed theft and the shame that goes with it. Cale moved to intercept. He tried to follow the cleaner into the back, but the cleaner slipped away like oil through fingers. A short scramble followed. A photographer, one of the official press, noticed the scuffle and thought it was part of the show. The cleaner smiled at the camera with the dishonest smile of a man used to being invisible and left under applause. We lost him. Again. A small gust of failure that tasted like iron in the back of my throat. Back at the penthouse, Lorenzo made a choice that felt like cutting an infection out rather than cauterizing. He wanted to make the evidence undeniable and immediate. He wanted to bring the proof directly to the politician's circle, to place it in the hands of those whose pockets flirted with compromise and then watched the ripple. He planned a public reveal and a private pressure. Public humiliation and private negotiation are not the same thing, but together they make a pair of scissors. "You'll be my face again," he said, and the way he said it was both command and plea. "You'll go out with me to Rustinowski's office. You'll be at my side and you'll smile." My acceptance was not simple. It was a ledger of costs and benefits. I ran through the math in my head. The bracelet, the napkin, Marco's death, Anthony's ledger, Sergio's betrayal. The trade was blunt and real. Be visible now and perhaps buy the time to leave later. I would be a witness who had been crafted into a tool that could be wielded for the right angle. I agreed. I took the card that Miss Petrova thrust into my palms, a name on a private guest list with a line that read, Liaison, A. Rossi. I practiced the smile like a woman who had learned to write apologies on the backs of receipts. The day we met Rustinowski in a private suite, The air smelled like polished wood and citrus. He was flatter in person than in paper, a small man who had invested heavily in public face and little in backbone. He offered a handshake that was almost sticky with courtesy. He did not look at me. He looked at Lorenzo like a man measuring a furniture piece by its aesthetic. "Mr. Vulkov," he said, "a pleasure to be of assistance to the city's philanthropic activities." He spoke with a politician's careful grammar. Lorenzo listened like a man who had spent his life on tempered edges. "You've had dealings with our associates," Lorenzo said, and his voice was a velvet rope around a throat. "There are ledgers." Rustinowski's eyes flicked to the napkin in my pocket like a man who perceived a storm on the horizon. He engaged in small talk about the museum's architecture and then sneaked back to disclaimers. He said words like misunderstanding and clerical error. He used euphemisms the way a florist uses leaves, to hide stems. I watched for the small things. The motion of his hand when he says clerical, the tilt of his head when he pretends ignorance. These are the gestures that make a man accountable if you know how to read them. I had learned the craft. Lorenzo placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside, under a clear sheet, lay the ledger, scraps, the ledgers, the courier's receipts. Paper translates into public record like nothing else. He slid the napkin across the wood, and the napkin acted like a witness once more. Rustinowski's face shifted a fraction. The smallest kind of weather that gives rain away. "I have lawyers," he said. "This is slander." "We also have receipts," Lorenzo said. "We have couriers, we have invoices." He slid a photograph across the table, a shot of Hawk's hand on a table, the ledger in front of it. "We have names." For a moment there was a hush like a held breath. The politician's aides, who had been present only to warm the room, suddenly looked small and like things that might be dismantled. "What do you want?" Rustinowski asked then, and I heard the word like someone asking how much for a man's silence. Lorenzo was simple. "You stop financing brigands who try to kill our people. You publicly withdraw support and acknowledge a discrepancy in your books. You name those who have been working with you." Rustinowski's laugh was a sound like money being counted. "You have no proof you can distribute that won't be simply dismissed as vendetta." "We have a camera feed," Lorenzo said. He pushed forward the photograph of the courier handing envelopes. "We will give this to the press if you do not cooperate. We will make sure it's public and that the names are attached." He was asking for control. Power is what men like Lorenzo broker, not always in good, but in real terms. The politician considered his options and realized he was flanked by two things he disliked: bad press and an enemy who could make trouble. In the end, Rustinowski chose his skin. He agreed to a quiet removal of funds from the staging company's account and a public statement about a thorough forensic review, the kind of statement that tastes like an apology and reads like a shelf for another lie. We had bent him into a small shape that made him less useful to Sergio and less able to hide Hawk under his wings. We left with a promise on paper and a man with less room for mischief. "You could have used the press," I said as we walked away. "You could have made it a spectacle." Lorenzo's fingers brushed mine, not in tenderness, but in the language of partnership. "There are consequences," he said. "A spectacle burns everything in the inferno, and then you have only ash." "Sometimes ash is a way out," I said. "Not if you need those bricks still standing," he answered. His pragmatism made me tired and also safe. The deal was a little like breathing, necessary and uncomfortable. We had turned a page in the ledger that made the conspiracy's margins smaller, but conspiracies are hydra-like. Cut one head and two more try to grow out of the city's soil. We had won something, a reduction in the immediate flow of illicit funds. We had lost something, the illusion that victory came without cost. People whisper after you make such decisions. Allies shift. Screws tighten. The night after the meeting, I sat in the library where the bracelet had become part of the architecture of my skin. He poured himself whiskey and lit a cigarette like a man who liked ceremonies that hurt his lungs and steadied his hands. "You did well," he said. "You keep your eyes open." "That's my job," I said. He stared at me with an expression that could have been gratitude if gratitude had teeth. "You could leave," he said suddenly. "I could provide papers. You could vanish." "Leave to where?" I asked. "I don't know the geography of a life that isn't arranged around the things I'm noticing." He studied the amber in his glass. "Anywhere you want. A different passport, a different name, no more being an asset." I put my hand on the bracelet and felt the metals cool. "You can buy me paper," I said. "You can't buy me forgetting." He didn't reply. He knows the trade-off. Ownership is a transaction, memory is not. Time made small compromises. The city's surface held for a while. Hawke's couriers asked fewer questions in daylight. Anthony's ledger got quieter. Sergio retreated into a corner with fewer allies, but peace made odd shapes. It presses on the soft parts until you realize what was once bright is now dulled by accommodation. I learned over the months to be an embedded instrument, a woman with new papers, a name that sounded like a promise, a translator's card on a slim chain. I wore the bracelet as if it were an insignia and kept the napkin folded in a pocket like a tiny, stubborn sermon. And yet, there was always the sense of an unfinished account. The ledger had been shifted, but not erased. Hawke's name still hung in the air like a rumor. Someone had paid a dear price for discretion, and someone else still wanted to change who owned the city. Sitting in the library, I realized survival had many forms. There was the small, everyday kind, eat, sleep, perform, and the strategic kind, gather evidence, make alliances, and place bets on the right people. You could call both living, but they are shaped by different morals. When Miss Petrova brought a letter on thick paper with a watermark I didn't recognize, my stomach did the thing it used to do when a glass balanced on a shelf threatened to fall. The envelope contained a single line of handwriting, an invitation to be present at the museum again. The gala they had used last time, a charity gala sequel, this time dressed in a ribbon the city could not help but notice. The invitation requested my attendance as Lorenzo's companion. On the back, a small flourish. For A. Rosie. I folded the napkin and pressed it into my palm. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. I had learned one more thing through all of this. Sometimes the only way to move from being a tool to being an agent is to accept the role long enough to change its definition. Tools can be reshaped. People who make themselves invisible for profession can let that same invisibility become something else. Camouflage used to step into a place where choices are made. I accepted the invitation. The bracelet was warm that morning like a living thing. I put it on with both hands. Ownership remained a fact. So did the napkin's instruction. So did the ledger's ink. We would go to the next gala. We would test the city's appetite for truth. We would see how much of it would digest. When I left the penthouse, Lorenzo walked me to the rolls and placed a hand on the small of my back, like a man who wanted to be courteous in a room where courtesy is currency. He did not kiss me in public. He did not need to. The city has sharp corners where certain intimacies must be kept private. I tucked the napkin in the inner seam of my coat. The letters showed through the linen like a laugh. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. I smiled, not as an order, but as a promise to myself that I would read every silence and turn it into something useful. We moved toward the gala like predators arranged as patrons. The city's lights made halos of small sins. I felt the bracelet against my wrist and the small, steady weight of being recognized. I felt smaller than I'd ever been, and, in a way, more dangerous. When the night opened and the city breathed, I understood the calculus. You can be owned and still own things in return. You can be marked and still mark back. The napkin would stay in my pocket. The bracelet would stay on my arm. The ledger would continue to breathe like a thing that needs to be watched. I had chosen, for now, to be someone's eyes and someone's instrument, not because I liked the bargain, but because there was a path forward that used the very things that bound me. I thought of Marco once more, of the tremor in his hands and the bead that had fallen into Lorenzo's glass. I thought of Anthony's small arithmetic. I thought of Sergio's smile and Rustinowski's tie. The city's web had been tugged, and we had felt the resonance. There would be more tugging. There would be a moment where I would choose to leave or to stay and press the lever I had been given. For now, the plan held. For now, I wore the bracelet and smiled and remembered the napkin's instruction at every doorway. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. Not exactly a promise of escape, but a line to live by while the city arranged itself. We pulled up to the museum and the light hit the bracelet and made it sing like a small, dangerous bell. Lorenzo offered his arm and I took it. The crowd parted like a sea for a rock. Cameras found faces and recorded them like mountains naming themselves. I smiled. I adjusted my dress. I tucked a hand into his elbow and did not leave. There are ways of surviving that ask you to be present in the moment danger arrives, not to be absent for safety's sake. There are ways of resisting that require you wear the costume of complicity and then cut the thread once you are close enough to the seam. I had no illusions. I knew the cost of being useful to a man like Lorenzo. I knew the bruise of being his. I also knew the ledger had spaces where one could write new things. If you survived being a witness, you could use your witness to change the narrative. You could turn your invisibility into a weapon and aim it. I folded the napkin one last time and pressed it into the crease of my palm like a talisman. The bracelet caught the flash of a camera and winked like a small private witness. I smiled for Rustinowski and for the crowds and for the city that had taught me how to read the dark. Don't drink it. Smile and leave now. I smiled, and I did not leave.